My name is John Johnson, a.k.a. JJ, and I'd like to share my I Remember story. I lived in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and I went to Hastings High School. It was an all-white high school, and so all of my friends were white. Well, we had just got back from summer vacation when the teacher decided to give us an exam. It was an English exam. She gave the exam, she marked the papers, and then she got up and walked over to my best friend who was sitting to my right, and she asked him, "Why did you let him copy the answers on your paper?" He told her that I didn't do it and that he had not let me do it. And she didn't believe him. So she sent me down to the principal's office. The principal immediately sent me home with a note saying that he wanted my parents to come up or I would be expelled. So my mother came up the next day. She went directly to the teacher's classroom and she demanded to know what proof the teacher had that I had cheated. Well, the teacher said that the paper that he had cheated from was from the boy that was sitting next to me, and he was the smartest kid in the class. So my mother said, "Well, how do you know my son was not the smartest kid in the class?" So by that time, the principal had come up, wanted to know what all the commotion was. So my mother explained to the principal that the teacher had said that I had cheated, and she wanted to know where the proof was. The teacher spoke to the principal, said that I had got the same grade that the smartest kid in the class had gotten. So my mother said, "Okay, give my son an exam right now." So the principal said, "Well, that's highly irregular." She says, "I don't care. Give him an exam right now." So the principal said that it was irregular, but that he would make up an exam and give it to her, and give it to me. So he made up the exam. It was about 50 questions. And he finished marking the exam, and he looked at me and shook his head. And then he looked at the teacher, and he said, "You owe him an apology." I had gotten 100 on the exam. So my mother said to the teacher, "I'm waiting for the apology for my son." So the teacher apologized, and the principal said not only that, but we will be getting a letter stating that we were sorry that this incident had taken place. So my mother said, "Well, okay, now what about the teacher?" And so the principal said, "Well, what are you talking about?" She said, instead of being a teacher, she looked at my complexion and she graded me on my complexion and not on my aptitude. And she told the principal that she should not be a teacher and that if he did not do something about her, that she would write a letter to I believe, the Board of Education. And so I got the letter. I was proud of my mother because she stood by me, and the teacher looked like an idiot. That's it.
Good afternoon. My name is David Brawley, and I'm the pastor of the St. Paul Community Baptist Church in the East New York section of Brooklyn. The St. Paul Community Baptist Church for the last 27 years has been committed to commemorating our ancestors, the Middle Passage, the Ma'afa, that great calamity, the Black Holocaust, to commemorate our ancestors, to say that our ancestors matter, and also to celebrate our sense of resilience as a people. This year, we have decided in this 27th commemoration to highlight the impact of trauma. Trauma, intergenerational trauma from microaggressions and just being black in America, trauma that's been induced through this pandemic. But the question today is, what about the children? Well, our special guest today is going to help us unpack trauma and the children. His name is Dr. Arthur Pressley. Pressley. Arthur Pressley is a clinical psychologist and a member of the faculty at Drew University. He also has a long track record of building relationships and fostering collaborations between community organizations and disparate and frequently underserved populations. In addition, Dr. Pressley has a broad background in social justice issues, particularly racial bias and disparities in healthcare, technological disasters, psychological assessments, and the criminal justice system. Trust me when I tell you his bio is extensive. I invite you to read his bio, available on our Facebook page and our social media platforms. I'm excited today on behalf of the St. Paul Nation to invite to this conversation Dr. Arthur Pressley. Let's hear from him. Welcome, Dr. Arthur Pressley, to St. Paul Nation and Ma'afa Week, our commemoration of the Ma'afa. This is 27 years of commemorating our ancestors and the Middle Passage. And this year, our focus is on trauma. And we've asked you to come and to share with us today and the St. Paul Nation because of your expertise in the area of childhood trauma. Dr. Pressley, what about the children in this moment? What about the children as we talk about compounded trauma, ancestral trauma, as we think about being Black in America, as we think about COVID-19 and the ways in which our communities have been disproportionately affected? What about the children? So I want to begin our time together by getting to know you. I understand that your work led you to Chernobyl to view the impacts of that catastrophe upon that community and its children. So I'm very curious today, and I'm sure St. Paul Nation wants to know, how did you come upon that? Tell us a little bit about your work, the scope of your work, and childhood trauma.
Okay, I started out as a pastor on the south side of Chicago. And I was really focused on a lot of the children in my community and my church. The number of parents who would bring their kids in, basically they said that they had a good kid. He was starting to hang out with gangs, use drugs, and I was trying to figure out what was happening. So I went back to graduate school and did a degree in clinical psychology. My work with children and trauma led me, as I'm doing research, I discovered that our kids in Chicago had the same problems around learning and family and drugs as kids in South Africa during the wars there, as the children on the Gaza Strip who had been living in tents for 3 generations, kids who were living in war zones in Africa, and started becoming aware of how that impacted children and their capacity to learn. Discovered that for each, particularly for kids who had experienced environmental trauma, and that is so important for the church, because a kid who's experiencing trauma in their community, to some extent, it doesn't matter what happens only in church. You can't bring a kid to church and save them, and they're going to have a lower rate of incarceration, substance abuse, teenage parenting, going to jail as kids in their neighborhood. So if St. Paul's going to make a difference in a child's life, it has to be focused on what's happening with the kids and the amount of trauma that they have out in the community. But your rate of pregnancy and substance abuse, even if you got them in 20 programs, people do all sorts of mentoring, rites of passage programs, all that stuff is good. But what happens with them in their community, with their mother and their father, all of that is connected. You can't separate one from the other. The other thing that we found out was that for each major stressor in the kid's life, mother and father are arguing, there's poverty, there's substance abuse, there's all sorts of issues. If you've got 4 major stressors, that's going to effectively, I hate to use the word IQ, but effectively drops their IQ by 40 points. So their capacity, all of their executive functioning, their capacity to plan, to remember, to observe what's going on, to take into account what they do, all of that is greatly lessened because of this trauma. And trauma is a fascinating thing. I wish I had a better way, a better term, but it's very much like the gift that keeps on giving. So if a child is overwhelmed with a violent act, they say that by the time a Black child is 17 years old, I think it's like 60, 70% have seen someone attacked by or attacked with some kind of a violent weapon, knife, gun, or club. Because this traumatic event will keep on giving and the child doesn't understand it, that child will start engaging in acts of violence throughout their life, trying to make sense of what happened. So the person who has a traumatic event, they're sexually abused when they're 8 years old, their sexual life is going to be out of control. Do you see what I mean? Because they will, they will replicate the act. The child who was in a car accident, you've seen a 5-year-old child, if they were in a car accident, when you watch their play, they will have cars that are falling off radiators, that are running into people. But part of that is that they're doing with their body what they can't do with their mind. And that is to understand the meaning and the impact and who they were and if it's safe to be in the world. It is a form of grieving and making sense and having power in your life in a way at which the trauma says, you ain't got no power, you don't mean nothing. And it could happen as easily tomorrow. So the child is preparing himself. He's getting ready for that next time that he has that feeling or that event happens again. Now, intergenerational trauma, there was a woman, I think her name was Helen Schultenberg, and she's talking about intergenerational trauma. Whatever the biochemical stuff that happens with people, when you have trauma, it's something that happens inside your body. Your body gets into a fight or flight kind of thing in which it's preparing itself to engage. That biochemical stuff, say, that exists in the mother is passed to the child when they're in utero. So if the mother's cortisol goes up when she has trauma, that's passed on through the child. So the child grows up with that same fight or flight thing. And that's also the way that you parent. So we know that once you've introduced trauma into a community, it easily passes on 7, 8, 9 generations.
Wow.
Because it not only affects the biochemical stuff that goes on to the mother, the way that the mother's going to parent the child is to always to be ready for that crisis, and her capacity to empathize with the child. And if she doesn't empathize with the child doesn't know who they are, and they don't develop empathy for themselves or for someone else. She might be very strict. She might be very punitive, and then that child will be that way. And that child will anticipate that's how God is, and that's also how they're going to relate to other kids in the neighborhood. So we know that culturally, psychologically, religiously, physiologically, and because this is so much fight or flight, literally the brain shrinks. If you look at a child who's 3 months old, their brain is developing thousands of new neurons every day. as a usual basis, you know.
Mm.
It's like a small computer that can build itself as it is learning to adapt to the world. Child has been through trauma, their brain is shrinking. And it's
Wow.
not developing those new neurons because it says the only thing that's important is fight or flight. So it's like you walk out of your house one day and a lion starts chasing you. And after a while, the brain says, wait a minute, you forget all that other stuff. You walk out the door, you look to find the danger, and you be ready to run.
Wow.
And after a while, the brain is such a marvelous thing. The parts of the brain that's communicating to the parts of the body and brain that are doing fights or flight, it'll send messages there before it sends messages to the frontal cortex that says, how do we think about this, you know?
Okay.
So it's like if you put your hand on a hot stove, your hand backs away even before the brain registered that it was hot and I need to move it. Think of trauma kind of wiring the brain of a person to do that. So the parts of the brain, the body, the mind is always reacting. So, you know, parents will say to kids, well, why didn't you think about that? But increasingly the frontal cortex, that part of the brain that says, what is ethical? What did my mama teach me? What is my obligation to the friend? That's not going to happen. It's like, wait a minute, when this happens and I hear this sound and I have this feeling inside, I need to get moving. And the parts of the brain typically that calms the person down, that says it's okay, you can go to sleep, those parts of the brain are functioning less and less. So this is something which in small ways gets passed on intergenerationally.
Okay.
So it becomes so important that the church is doing what it does because the church is starting to do for the person and the family and the child what that child lacks the capacity to do for themselves.
Can you talk more about that and unpack that for us in terms of what churches can do in this moment?
Can I tell a couple of stories before?
Sure, please do. Please do.
2 or 3 different stories in terms of that intergenerational trauma and what that looks like and what that feels like. One of the most interesting books that's come out in the last 3 or 4 years is called The Personal Librarian. You know, the woman, I think her name was Bella DaCosta Green. She was the personal librarian for J.P. Morgan. She went around the world buying rare collections. She was self-taught. She worked on his library. And, you know, she was self-taught, but also worked at Princeton's library. You know, that's how J.P. Morgan found her. Now, and she, like I said, had carte blanche, traveled the world building up his library. This is an African-American woman.
Oh.
Nobody knew she was African-American. Now, it's not that she grew up in housing projects in DC. Her father was the first Black man that graduated from Harvard University. He became dean of Harvard Law School. And she still lived her entire life as a white person, which means there is no recording of her ever contacting or being in touch with her father once she started passing for white. So part of how I think about trauma and Black folks is that there's part of the message that says it is not safe to be Black, no matter what.
Wow.
No matter what.
Wow.
So, because so much of how we interpret the trauma and what came about is related to our minds. You know, that's what created the myopic, the middle passage. That's, you know, those early years. Anything that we did was treated as an act of insurrection,
Yes.
which means they could do whatever they wanted to. So the amount of discomfort with my body and other people with bodies like mine. And I think, I hate to say this, but I think rap artists sometimes feel like they understand that struggle with, don't matter whether you got on a suit or a hoodie, whether you're selling drugs or going to law school, all y'all gonna be like a nigga out there. And anything that you do to show off the white society, which is why whites haven't freaked out the way that we think that they should with all the shooting of black men. You know, we're trying to ask a racist court and racist school systems. And do you see what I mean?
Sure.
And they're clear that just our being alive is an act of insurrection. And that then becomes part of the trauma that the kid is living with in terms of their black skin. You know, if I jump around too much, you forgive me, brother.
Keep going, Doc. This is great.
When I was invited to be lead psychologist for the program in Chernobyl, I was listening to a speech by a brother by the name of Chester Pierce. And Chester Pierce is one of the heaviest brothers ever lived on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
When they were trying to decide how they're going to select people to go into outer space, Chester Pierce set up the protocol. When they decided, you know, who could live in a nuclear submarine under an ice cap, Chester Pierce developed those kinds of projects. Integrating federal government services, Chester Pierce set that up. You hear the term microaggressions now.
Yes.
That was the term that was developed by Chester Pierce. He taught up at Harvard for a number. And in his speech, he says people ask him, how could he do all that stuff? And Chester Pierce said, well, I've been teaching Black people to stay sane in the United States. Deciding who can survive in outer space is easy if I can help Black people in this situation. So I heard his speech right after their invitation, and I said, yeah, you know. So it was a project looking at thyroid cancer, what happens to the brain when it's been exposed to radiation, the relationship to learning cancer, a variety of other stuff. So just sort of understanding just how pervasive and how powerful and just how challenging the conditions are for Black folks.
Did you want to unpack that Chernobyl, what you learned in
Yeah,
that study, being a lead researcher?
yeah. We learned that oh God, I made a major error early on, my first year there, because early on we were seeing lesions on the brains of the children, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So you've got children living with low levels of radiation, and you're seeing much higher than normal amounts of lesions on the brain. And I'm like saying, you know, this is a slam dunk, you know? This has to be low levels of radiation. The Ukrainian, Russian guys who were also scientists who were part of the project, they were like, no, you know, trauma will do the same thing. Trauma can shrink the brain.
Right.
It can give you lesions. It can give you all of the physiological stuff that you're saying only happens in the face of radiation. You know, my first few months, I'm like, no, you guys are just ignoring how bad the contamination was. Several years later, discovered that what they were saying about the impact of trauma and what happens in terms of the body's immunization, you know, the body's capacity to fight cancer, you know, high blood pressure, diabetes, all of this stuff in terms of thyroid, all of these physiological stuff in terms of cardiac problems, diabetes, all high blood pressure, all of that stuff that we were tagging around radiation, which radiation will do. But more and more could see that that was the impact of trauma. Now, in terms of resilience and the role of the church.
Yeah, that's where I wanted to go, because all that you just laid out seems so daunting.
Yeah.
So, you know, talk about the
Yeah.
resilience of
Yeah.
Black folk. Given the context as you've laid it out, we shouldn't even be here.
Yeah. Yeah. Think of the most powerful thing that a person does that changes them physically, spiritually, cognitively, is a sense of awe and transcendence. When people have this experience, this encounter with anything, you know, with some people, that sense of awe is on a mountaintop, you know, it's appreciating a work of art. It is having a once in a lifetime experience. And for white people, that can be individual. The area of positive, it's positive psychology, and it's called, you know, the psychology of awe, says that the brain takes on a kind of neuroplasticity. The brain starts healing itself. The respiration, other physiological changes happen with that sense of awe, that appreciation of beauty, that sense of transcendence and wonder is transforming psychologically, physically. So I'm part of a research project. We just applied for an NIH grant for people, for women with breast cancer. And our component is to work with pastors and churches, arguing that their capacity for transcendence or awe or encounter with the holy is going to make a major difference in the survival of cancer and the quality of life. Not only that, people are more generous when they have this encounter of awe or the holy or spiritual wonder.
Are you connecting this to our religious experience, our spiritual experience?
Yeah, that's the major thing that needs to happen with people's life. And Black folks and Africans, more so than some other people, that is, we experience that through other people. It is a relational experience.
Yes.
It's why we've got to come to church, as opposed to being with ourselves on our radio, which I still contend is very much an individual experience. But it is that collective experience of awe, which gives us a sense of transcendence and vastness. Vastness connects us to this larger university, and it gives us a sense that there is something more powerful that we are connected to that are going on here, both within my community and in the universe. So trauma says you are this point of pain. That sense of awe says, no, you are part of something that is much greater, that is wondrous, that has been here for millions of millennia.
Dr. Pressley, is it possible then, when we engage in the work of sacred memory, that our brains get rewired?
Yeah, yes. There is a New York Times article that came out about 4 years ago. That's the title of the article was "Your Brain on Novels." And what it said was, when a person reads a novel, whether it's taking a trip to Tahiti or some weird adventure, the brain records that as if it has happened to the self.
Wow.
So when you do Daniel in the lion's den, and your whole country just got wiped out because of this foreign occupation, you were taken over as slaves, you were made to be nobody, and God saw you as special, and you got with those Hebrew boys, and no matter what they did, God, the brain then starts recording that for the child, in a way. It says, yeah, this has happened to your people, and y'all were in slavery and you were taken away, but you were functioning with your people, you were paying attention to your diet, all of this was done in service to your God, and God helped you to overcome that, And that's why Easter services, I think, have such a rich attendance, because we dramatize that more at Easter time. That thing that said, sometimes preacher and other people complain that more popes show up at Easter, but it could be at Easter we do what we're supposed to be doing better than we're doing other days. We're celebrating and we're singing. We're saying that there was a crucifixion, but we talk about the mightiness of, and for the child, they're interpreting that narrative.
So, Doc, talk to us. This is such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful for your presence today with us. Can you talk about the power of stories?
Oh God. I mean, our whole life is a story, right? If someone says, Pressley, who are you? I'm like, oh, my people were originally Gullah. We were brought over here to do, you know what I mean? So I'm retelling that. But I particularly tell the story for my children because that story is part of my identity and it's the way that they take in. So someone says, who's your daddy? They tell the story. These crazy people eat rice 3 meals a day. And my great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother was a slave, and she was a Native American slave. She married an African slave. Do you see what I mean?
Sure.
So their narrative that they would tell of us was that we were running in and out of caves. We would come over, and they're continuing to show that narrative to us every day, right?
Yes.
So even if you watch commercials, black child by the time he's 2 years old has seen more than 200 hours of commercials, all with the same little narrative, right? That cats talk more than black people, Black people are always on things doing what comes naturally. They're never saying, I buy this because I love my family. So we are impulsive, we're denigrated, even in a 30-second commercial, and that child is always taking those narratives in, and that defines who they are. So we come to church and we have other kinds of narratives that they experience with you that says we are more than that. We are special in the universe. We are the people of God. And because narratives are things that not only we learn, but we learn through our bodies, right? We learn through our bodies even before our minds. So and this is an example of one of my running buddies. When the children of Israel were coming out of Egypt, they were led by the fire in the night and the smoke during the day, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And what was happening is that when the fire and the smoke got up and moved, the people would get up and move, right?
Yes.
When I move, you move. Just like that. When I move, you move. Ludacris was a bad dude. But what they call that is mirror neurons. So the child learns to be a person by the mother mimicking what the child does. When the mother sticks out its tongue, the child sticks out his tongue, you know what I mean?
Sure.
So the child is learning identity in that relationship. They're learning what to do. They're learning who they are and to develop empathy and identity. So we tell stories in the church, but we're also acting out stories. And as we are telling the stories and acting them out, they're learning to do the same thing with their bodies. They see the story where Black people care for each other, and then you take them down and they're part of your feeding program, and they are learning to act out the program. They see what you do and they do it. When you move, they move, just like that.
So, Doc, technology. In this moment, technology has served to keep us connected. Our ministries have had to become virtual. It was a form of adaptation and even survival. And at the same time, technology, access to information, 24/7, images, television. And I think I've read that our children watch more television than others. I don't know if that is true or not, but that there's the possibility that our children are impacted by the images that they see in ways that are far more detrimental than others. Those are some of the things that I've heard. What does the science say behind those things?
I think that is one of the crucial questions of the day. In terms of understanding technology and its impact, we've only just put our hands on the doorknob. We're not even into it yet. So this conversation about technology, what it does, what it doesn't do, assume that we're just getting at the starting line. So our capacity or the need to research it, study it, engage it, and to ask all sorts of questions. So I think in some of the latest reports that I've read that says of the stuff on technology and what it does or doesn't do, you know, what, Google is paying for 70, 80% of that? You know what I mean? So
Wow.
It's asking a pharmaceutical to do research on its own, you know, or it's asking Toyota
Right.
to do something on the impact of the car and the convenience and what it's. So what I've seen, and so some of the earlier stuff that I have been tracking are people like Sherry Turkle, who was one of those early people at MIT for many years. And at first, she's really celebrating technology and what it does. So I've got friends in the United States from Africa. Once a week, they have a family call on Zoom. Part of his family is in Africa, some of it's in England, some of it's in Canada, and the family gathers once a week. So, you know, and, you know, to some extent, the United States has always been doing this, you know. If you look back in terms of distant education, even in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, they were developing ways for farm boys out in the middle of Kansas to be able to attend school. You know what I mean? But this place that we are, I think a new door is there, and I don't know. So you've got some people that would argue that when I'm sitting with you face to face, there are 10,000 minute forms of communication. I'm aware of what you do with your body. You see what I mean?
Sure.
All of that is greatly reduced and it's more controlled. So they are saying or arguing, they're wondering if that doesn't make people much more rigid and overly sensitive to. You know, so somebody turns into your worship service online. If there's anything about that that they dislike, they're off to 3, you know, there's 10 other services they've got on their computer, which says something about control and, you know, all of those subtle messages about. So does it increase our capacity for community? Or is it communicating something other that is far more rigid, far more sensitive in terms of, so are we losing the capacity to be with people where those relationships are far more strenuous and difficult? And so a kid can be with this other kid, with this group of friends. And before, if you were hanging out with your boys, you'd be arguing and fighting. Should we do this? Could we say this? How much that kid is actually with those other folks when he's with them. You see what I mean? And the learning and the growing and the connection, which is so important for identity and community. So I think that people's capacity for doubt decreases with the use of technology.
Wow.
You know, because if you've got a question, Wikipedia gives it to you instantly, right?
Yeah.
Now, and I'm saying it has strong implications for you as pastors and stuff, because you can't grow spiritually unless you've got the capacity to doubt God. You know, that's what was happened with Job and other, you see what I mean?
Sure.
So people's capacity to trust themselves, their capacity to understand scale because of all the stories. Somebody says Boko Haram went into a village, 200 people were killed because of all the numbers. You see what I mean? Those things don't mean anything. So people's capacity for scale, their capacity to be with others, for doubt, all of those things that are essential to growing and building community and struggling with the question, all of that stuff which are necessary. So even if we are dependent upon technology, are there other associated and additional things? And technology is not going to go away. You see what I mean?
Sure.
It's like being on a bullet train. So the question isn't technology or not technology. It is what associated things need to be happening to compensate for that slide that may be there, but that slide's going to be there.
Okay. So now let me first of all, thank you for all of your time and all of the knowledge that you are imparting to the St. Paul Nation. As we make our way to the close of this segment, I want you to, if you can, to give some practical steps or pointers or points of focus for pastors and churches to think about, and faith communities to think about in terms of the children, healing modalities, best practices, things we can be doing in this moment to help our children through this ma'afa and residual trauma.
Oh, thank you for the question. And I wish I had a really good answer. In one of the communities that we developed a protocol of psychological tests that we had to evaluate. And in one of the schools that we went to, in one of the area where it was just very high levels of radiation, the teachers were just overwhelmed because the students' capacity to learn and stuff wasn't there. And the program that we developed was to greatly increase the children's capacity for play and their time for play. They were running and being with each other. All of that stuff reduced the cortisol in their blood. It also tightened their relationship. Learning and identity are all corporate acts, right? So having the children play together, help them with transitions. The other thing is, if you give a child that experience of awe, or you increase their capacity for play, the brain replicates that and it creates the capacity for that in ever growing places. So how much, when children come to church, do we allow them to participate and play? Are we expecting them to do something with their body that probably ain't good for the body of adults, which is to sit and pass? So for me, when I go to the church, the amount of passivity, you know, the number of times and I want to be critical, but where praise singers are, as opposed to more congregational things
Yes.
where people are singing and moving and doing stuff. Children's capacity, when they read the story of Daniel or whatever, for them to develop their own story of resurrection, of Daniel. They create their own narrative. Essentially, you're paying a lot of money for that to happen in play therapy. To encourage people to have those intergenerational stories. When I raise the hands, sometimes when I work with kids, I'll say, how many of you have had Bible study in your homes before you go anywhere? You'd be surprised at how, or if I ask the children, when did your parent, what was happening in their life? So the parents need to constantly be saying, I pay my bill, I do this to my neighbor because of this encounter that I had. And not to tell the story as if it was them like Moses on a mountaintop where they encountered, but that some old lady in the neighborhood who only had $2 gave them $1 to. So rehearsing and play and telling stories and moving. But ask yourself, of all the stuff that happens in church, what gives that child a sense of wonder? What gives them a sign? So, we've got our parts of the service, and too many of us, I think, have essentially gone to marketing things that says these are things that people like, it'll keep them coming forward. I don't know if anybody has done an assessment of the experience of a child at church and say, what is that moment in a church where a child has a sense of wonder?
Wow.
And I would say that both for the child and for the parent. But that sense of wonder is so healing and transforming, and the generosity and the connection and the self-sacrifice, all of that grows, and that replicates itself even more powerfully than what trauma does.
Dr. Pressley, is there anything else that you want to offer in closing to the St. Paul Nation?
I was there for one of your Maafa, and y'all blew my head off. Okay? I just had a great time. I would just want to redefine one theological term, and that is the notion of hope. I think that what trauma does is it prevents relationships, prevents connections. Hope, as I understand it, particularly in Jeremiah, hope is like one of those patchwork blankets. Hope is a relational term. It's things that knits us together. It's not an anticipation of future. It's not a sense of confidence. It's not an assuredness. Hope is something, as well as health. Both hope and health are communal processes. Yes. It's my hanging out. So those things that has you doing stuff, whether it's bringing it, but just, and that's why I like them out, because you guys were telling the story together, which for me was the essence of how the Bible and what I think was happening throughout the New Testament, where Christ was reconnecting with. So anyway, his ram, and thank you. And I really appreciate this time, Doc.
St. Paul Nation, you've been listening to Dr. Arthur Pressley, psychologist, scholar, who has helped us to unpack childhood trauma. I'm going to have Dr. Pressley back in the near future to help us think through this in a Master Ma'afa class. So look out for that. Tonight, we have an additional segment with Bishop C. Guy Robinson talking about how to create a trauma-informed church. So these two presentations go hand in hand. They bookend, and I think without a doubt, I am grateful for the scholarship in our own community. And I'm grateful to you, Dr. Pressley, for your scholarship and your ministry and your heart. Thank you for what you are doing to help heal our people.
Oh, thank you. I feel honored, blessed in so many ways that a community like St. Paul, which is doing so many things, and your choice of people that you can bring in is incredibly vast, so that you would open the door for me. I am honored and I thank you.
We are the better for the relationship. Thank you, Dr. Pressley.
Thank you. Take
St.
care.
Paul Nation, don't let anybody steal your joy.
Bye now.